autoridades da infraestrutura no mundo. Essa é a verdade. E eu não estou exagerando. In the world, yeah. That's correct, yeah. He's a humble man, you know. Mas eu vou depois só fazer a apresentação aqui em português para que todo mundo possa entender o que está acontecendo. Nós estamos só colocando os slides. Eu vou pedir para a Daniela também trazer aqui a obra e eu vou tentar presentear todos, né? Nós tivemos a honra de traduzir essa obra, que é uma obra épica, é a obra mais importante sobre o tema do Project Finance no mundo. Foi um trabalho difícil, almost 4 years of translation of the Project Finance, yeah. Mas a gente tinha muita preocupação de que essa obra ela pudesse ser de uma qualidade, né, que pudesse representar a qualidade do livro. Essa era a grande dificuldade. Um livro, talvez, dos mais vendidos no mundo, né, na Chinese Business Review, ficou em 3º lugar, enfim, um livro realmente muito importante. E a presença do Yescombe conosco é motivo de enorme orgulho e consegue, né, de alguma forma, encerrar com chave de ouro nossas reuniões desse ano. Mas, antes de tudo, eu queria passar a palavra ao nosso presidente, Carlos Sanseverino, para que pudesse fazer uma saudação, para que pudesse, de alguma forma, interagir conosco aqui, para que, na sequência, eu passe a palavra ao Renan e depois, finalmente, ao nosso palestrante e, obviamente, dando a oportunidade de todos que quiserem se manifestar também, fiquem super à vontade. Vamos fazer disso um encontro, como sempre, um encontro informal, e a ideia aqui é debater e refletir. Nós vamos ter uma verdadeira aula aqui, vocês tenham certeza disso. Presidente.
Muito bem. Boa tarde a todos. Inicialmente, saudando o nosso vice-presidente, toda a diretoria da Comissão de Infraestrutura, Logística e Desenvolvimento Sustentável, da Ordem dos Advogados do Brasil. Trago aqui notícias do Colégio de Presidentes que ocorreu esse final de semana e que eu externarei as impressões, a questão da Carta de Campinas, na nossa próxima reunião, com o objetivo de atualizar a todos, bem como trazer notícias especialíssimas sobre a nossa comissão e o próximo ano vindouro. Por oportuno e por respeito ao nosso vice-presidente, que traz aqui uma das maiores autoridades do planeta em infraestrutura, nós vamos focar todo o nosso tempo hoje nesse trabalho. Eu cuido aqui de uma emergência que está até na mídia e que, por uma questão ética, vou deixar aqui de declinar, que me impediu de estar aí hoje. Mas eu não poderia estar melhor representado do que o tradutor da obra, nosso vice-presidente, festejado professor, Dr. Dalpozo, que carrega na sua história e na história da sua família toda a credibilidade e que nos traz muita segurança de que nós estamos fazendo uma história frente a esta comissão estadual, bem como com os nossos co-irmãos, IBEG, IBDE, IASP, trazendo aqui notícias de que amanhã eu estarei almoçando com o presidente do IBDE e do IASP para tratar parcerias para este ano novo, já convidando o nosso vice-presidente, que para nós também é o presidente do IBEG. Com essas considerações, justificando a minha ausência, e já aproveitando, queria aqui destacar que eu tive a honra de receber a obra do professor, está aqui a obra do professor, está aqui, depois eu vou deixar com o Dr. Dalpozo para colher a assinatura dele e do professor, quero guardar num lugar muito especial da nossa biblioteca, e neste momento, então, saudar o teacher and Dr. Yescombe, great honor for all, and especially to our Ordem dos Advogados do Brasil. Welcome, teacher. Fica aqui a nosso carinhoso abraço e vou pedir, então, para que o Dr. Dalpozo, doravante, assuma a presidência dos trabalhos e possa conduzir essa reunião que fica para os anais da OAB, como uma das reuniões mais importantes que nós realizamos desde a nossa assunção e, claro, que isso fica registrado para toda a nossa Ordem dos Advogados, para a seção de São Paulo. Nós temos hoje 1 milhão, e olha esse número, doutor Dalpozo, para passar aqui para o nosso convidado, 1.580.000 advogados no país, e estamos alcançando... alcançando a marca aqui no estado de São Paulo de quase 600 mil advogados. Portanto, nós estamos entre nós somos a maior sociedade civil do Brasil e uma das maiores do mundo. Devolvo a palavra ao nosso presidente, doutor Dalpozo, que doravante, então, será o presidente em exercício da nossa comissão à frente desse trabalho. Eu vou desligar a minha câmera, mas sigo ouvindo enquanto me for possível. Um abraço, um bom trabalho a todos.
Muito obrigado, meu presidente. Jamais conduzirei com a sua maestria essa reunião, mas tentarei fazer o máximo que eu posso para que a gente possa cumprir aqui com esse desiderato que, como o nosso presidente disse, talvez esse seja realmente um marco das nossas reuniões aqui, por ter Tóquio Mitsubishi, e que, portanto, traz todo esse cabedal de conhecimento para que nós aqui no Brasil possamos cada vez mais refletir, entender, e eu como agradecer, né, de maneira tão intensa a presença dele. Eu vou passar a palavra para o Renan para fazer alguns comentários e já fazer a apresentação. O Renan foi um dos que mais me auxiliou, né, nesse processo de tradução. Na verdade, o nome dele deveria estar aqui também, porque realmente foi uma pessoa que foi fundamental no processo de tradução dessa obra, e que, portanto, tem um conhecimento bastante aprofundado, né, Renan, do conhecimento, do entendimento, Ele não gosta de ser chamado de professor, porque ele diz que nunca deu aula, né, o professor Yescombe, mas a gente chama de professor porque acaba sendo um mestre da prática, né, mas o Renan é um dos caras que mais conhecem aqui no Brasil o pensamento dele, e, portanto, é uma honra tê-lo aqui conosco também, para poder fazer essa introdução e apresentá-lo para a nossa comissão. Renan. Isso.
Obrigado, Augusto. Obrigado, presidente Carlos Severino. Sempre uma honra estar aqui na nossa OAB. É um pouco estranho falar para tão pouca gente e não enxergar a plateia que está na internet, né? Eu não me acostumei com isso ainda, mas, enfim, eu não quero perder muito mais tempo para a gente poder aproveitar a presença do Yescombe aqui. Como o Augusto falou, né, ele não gosta muito de ser chamado de professor porque ele é um cara da prática. Então, a gente fala, ele escreveu o livro e ele literalmente escreveu o livro sobre Project Finance. Não há quem fale sobre isso que não cite o livro dele. Então, a missão de traduzir o livro foi muito para tornar esse conhecimento acessível em língua portuguesa, um conhecimento que ficava muito mais restrito antes. Agradeço as palavras e acho que o que a gente veio aqui hoje é para ouvir o professor Yescombe, embora ele não goste de ser chamado assim. Então, eu devolvo a palavra para o nosso vice-presidente para ele encaminhar a sessão e abrir a palavra para o nosso querido Yescombe.
To start, I have a very good news because we already bought the rights from the PPP. Oh, right. Yeah, so we have like a long, another journey, you know, but it will be so great because as you translate this book, that it's like, you know, it's precious. It's so nice because you can learn a lot with your lessons here. Yeah. And I know that in the PPP book, it will be the same. So thank you so much. I think we're going to start next year in January, the translation, and maybe we can reach in 2025. And I hope you can come back for this big party, you know, that we pretend to do. See another big book. Yeah. So the floor is yours. Please. Thank you so much. It's a great honor. The slides, please. Slides estão aí? Nossa.
Oh, okay. All right. Okay. Okay, so good evening, everybody. I apologize for not speaking in Portuguese. I'm afraid if I was speaking in Portuguese, it would be a very short lecture. And I hope my English is not too difficult to understand. So my subject today is why public-private partnerships have fallen out of favor in Britain. It may even surprise you to know that we don't do them anymore. And I'm going to go over why that is, and to a certain extent, what the consequences of that have been. Now, when I'm talking about public-private partnerships in this context, I'm talking about what in Britain is called the PFI, or Private Finance Initiative model of government-paid PPPs. Now, by comparison with user-paid concessions like toll roads. It's a system of PPP that, as we'll see, was started in Britain and has been imitated all over the world, including in Brazil. In Brazil, you have the so-called administrative concessions under the law of 2004, as I understand from Professor Augusto. Position in Britain on the latest statistics was that in March 2023, there were 669 projects outstanding. At the peak, there were around 800 such projects. The capital value, the remaining capital value of these projects was the equivalent of $60 billion. At the peak, it was about 50% more than that. The main sectors in which these projects took place were in schools, where there were over 200 projects, but each project covered many schools. So in fact, there were thousands of schools that were rebuilt under the system, and also in hospitals. But in fact, it's spread throughout the entire public sector, government offices, waste management, which is the area, in fact, where I continue to work in the UK. I work for the British Department of the Environment, which is a government department that deals with waste management, and I'm part of a team that advises local government on their projects in this sector, because waste management PPP projects are actually particularly complex and particularly open to dispute, I should say. But in other sectors too, such as roads, street lighting, social housing, prisons, courts, libraries, the list goes on. Hundreds of these projects altogether. But since 2010, there have been very few of these projects. Waste management has been one of the few areas where they've continued. And the PFI program was formally terminated by the government in 2018. And at that time, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, which is what we call the Minister of Finance, said in Parliament, "I remain committed to the use of public-private partnership where it delivers value for money, where it delivers value for the taxpayer. But there is compelling evidence that the private finance initiative does not deliver value." And it was for that reason that the government stopped the program. So where did this come from? Well, I think we need to go back in history a little bit. Well, quite a way, perhaps to the 18th century, to the beginning of PPPs in Britain. As in a number of other countries, the French, I think, claim to be the inventor of concessions. I think originally a canal project in the 17th century. In Britain, they became important in the road system. The British road system was built by the Romans. The Romans, of course, left in the year around about 350 AD, and nobody had maintained the roads since then. So it's not surprising they weren't in a very good condition. So a system of trusts, turnpike trusts were set up, where local people would get acts of parliament and the ability to charge tolls, to borrow money based on the tolls, and to improve the roads. And that's how the road system, the British road system, was finally improved. And it made a huge difference to communications in the country. Also, you may be interested to know that most of the bridges in London were built as concessions, and people used to have to pay to cross the bridges. It only cost 1 penny which is not very much. But I think around about the year 1850, the government bought out the concessions, and there was a big celebration. Everyone was crossing over the bridges because it now costs nothing. But this kind of use of private sector finance for infrastructure fell out of use as both the state and municipalities took over infrastructure construction using local, national or local taxes and national local borrowing from the mid-19th century. And if we jump on to the middle of the last century, after World War II, there was really quite a neglect of public infrastructure. And as a result, a backlog of investment and a backlog of maintenance. And the government budget was simply insufficient to pay for all this. So the change began, as many changes did, in the 1980s with the Thatcher government. And the idea was to find ways of bringing in private sector investment, which of course could not be counted as government debt, and so could fill this investment and maintenance backlog. And this was done initially in several ways. First of all, through the privatization of infrastructure that could be financed by the public sector. And this meant, to begin with, privatizing state companies. Britain, again, was one of the first countries in the world to privatize its state companies. Many other countries have followed that route since. So companies like British Airways and Rolls-Royce, which were state-owned companies, were privatized and continue to be private companies. And then the next step was to look at utilities, and this is moving more towards the kind of infrastructure that we're talking about. And it was actually in the early 1990s, kind of just after the Thatcher government, that we began to see the privatization of utilities in electricity, in gas supply, in water. Of course, they're still regulated, but they're privatized. And then, again, in the mid-1980s, there was a revival of this idea of using transport concessions, of which the most important was the Channel Tunnel between Britain and France. Financially, I was a banker in those days, and I can tell you financially it was an utter disaster. The banks lost about half their money, which gives you an idea. But nonetheless, it got built, and it, of course, continues to operate. And the advantage of these is that these are self-funding. These were self-funding projects. They're paid for by the users. And of course, they weren't counted as government debt. But the problem was you can't use this structure for social infrastructure in particular, schools, hospitals, and so forth. And that's where there was a huge problem. And this is where the next stage of development came in. And it was in 1992 that the government set up what they called the Private Finance Initiative, trying to find ways of bringing in private finance into public infrastructure. I think the microphone is now working again. It wasn't working, was it? Anyway, I hope everybody could hear me. So the idea was to use private finance for government-paid projects where users are not paying. So the structure is a structure that you're all familiar with. It's a structure where the private sector designs, builds, finances, and operates an asset providing the public service. The public sector pays a service fee. It has various different names, but that payment covers the return on investment and debt service, and it covers the operating and maintenance costs, provided the project is built to the required specification and provided it continues to be available for use. So it's a kind of availability type of payment. And at the end of this period, which is under a contract between the public and private sector, the project reverts to public sector ownership and control at the end of that time. Now, interestingly, in 1992, the expression public-private partnerships did not exist outside the United States. Nobody used it, which is why this strange name Private Finance Initiative was initially used and continues to be used in Britain. The term public-private partnership says, you'll find, Professor Augusta, when you translate my book on private-public partnerships, I've researched the history of that term. And it goes back a long way in the United States. It goes back to the beginning of the last century. But it has had lots of different meanings. And of course, it still continues to have lots of different meanings. The term public-private partnership is used in all kinds of ways around the world. So anyway, that's why PPP wasn't used at that time. So this idea of PFI was a completely new idea at the time, but it actually was politically uncontroversial. There was no political opposition to it at the time. So as a result, when the government changed and the Tony Blair government came into power in 1997, and Gordon Brown, who later succeeded him as his Chancellor of the Exchequer, but as Prime Minister, was at the time Chancellor of the Exchequer. And they developed PFI very much from what had happened in the previous years. They really kind of turbocharged the whole system much more effectively. And one of the things they did, which was very important, was in 1999, they published the first standard form for PFI contracts, was published by the Treasury or the Ministry of Finance. That's important to understand because you have a different situation here, I think, that unlike civil law countries, in the common law, PPPs don't require specific legislation. Governments have the power to sign contracts. They don't need to have a law that allows them to sign the contracts. There are some common law countries that have passed PPP laws, but they're really just to kind of to set out a structure rather than to increase government powers. But of course, public procurement laws continue to apply in that kind of situation. And I may say that after publishing, just go back, after publishing that initial standard form, which was a kind of generic standard form, then other standard forms were published for specific sectors. So there are standard PFI contracts for schools or for hospitals or for waste contracts, which, as I mentioned, of the type that I'm involved in particularly, were also published by different government departments based on this initial standard contract. So again, I think you're all familiar, but just to illustrate the basic structure of what we're talking about, we have a project company which is set up to carry out the particular project, a special purpose company, or SPV as the term is often used. It signs a PFI contract with what I call in my book a public authority, that is a public sector party. This can be the central government, it can be a local government, it can be a state organization of some sort, whatever is in the public sector. So that I use that generic term public authority. I think I actually invented that term, although it's now used widely in Britain. So they signed the PFI contract, which has got terms similar to what I've already described. They raised finance from investors providing equity and lenders providing project finance debt, that you can read all about project finance in this big book that you have copies of. One of the things the project company does, which in fact is something that the lenders and to a certain extent investors require, is to reduce the risks in the project. They pass down risks to subcontractors. So you have, in the case of, say, a school contract, a design and build contractor who builds the school, and he will normally do this for a fixed price and for a fixed completion date, and will suffer penalties if he doesn't meet that fixed completion date. Although I may say that is becoming nowadays becoming more difficult to get contractors to sign this kind of contract because they've lost too much money on them. Then also there will be a maintenance contract signed that after completion, the building will be maintained and looked after, and also the services will be provided. That may also be included as part of the contract. So that's just the kind of standard structure, which again, I guess many of you are already quite familiar with. So what started to go wrong with PFI? Well, it went wrong really from the very beginning. And the root of this problem was the concept of value for money, which was a key concept under which the political sale, should we say, of PFI took place. And what is value for money? Well, if we look at the definition published by the British Treasury in 2004, what they said then was that PFI should only pursue where it delivers value for money, where value for money is the optimum combination of whole life cost and quality or fitness for purpose to meet the user's requirement, and does not always mean choosing the lowest bid. Now, I guess you're probably all familiar with this in terms of public procurement. Value for money is not just the cheapest bid; it's also the who's most competent, who is providing the best solution, etc., etc. So that's all fine. But then it goes on in the next sentence: it should not be chosen to secure a particular balance sheet treatment. What is meant by that is you shouldn't choose PFI because it's not government debt, and therefore it's off balance sheet. But this was even at the time, a hypocritical statement, because the whole point of PFI was to enable infrastructure that was not counting as government debt. And this was linked in with the whole argument of whether PFI is better than public infrastructure. And the main argument of PFI, and PPPs in general, of course, is that the government can borrow money more cheaply. Obviously, the cost of private sector finance for a PFI or PPP project is greater than a government's cost of borrowing. But of course, you're comparing, as we say in English, apples and oranges, two different things when you say that, because of course the government can borrow money more cheaply because the people who are lending to the government are not taking risks on a particular project. They're just taking risks on the government. So it's obvious government borrowing is cheaper. But at the same time, when the government itself does a project, it's taking that risk. So the public sector as a whole, and ultimately the taxpayers as a whole, are still bearing these risks. And in PFI, you are transferring, or PPPs in general, you are transferring most of these risks to the private sector. So if you're going to produce a value for money calculation, what you've got to do is to add the cost of that risk to the public procurement so that you can then compare the public procurement with a PPP to see which is better value for money when you do that. The problem is, how do you value this risk transfer? And the way it was done in Britain was through something called the public sector comparator. And this public sector comparator was used to determine whether PFI was value for money as compared to public sector, and therefore it determined whether or not the PFI project went ahead as a PFI project. And the public sector comparator, or PSC, was a benchmarking system. What you did was you calculated the lifetime costs of a standard public procurement, in other words, both the cost of building it and the cost of running it for its whole life, and compared that with the lifetime cost of a PFI contract. But you also took into account what was called optimism bias, and I'll explain that a bit more in a moment. In other words, the value of the risk transfer to the private sector in the PFI project, and you added this to the cost of the public sector project. So if this adjusted public sector cost was greater than the PFI cost, the PFI project would go ahead. But if the public sector cost was less than the PFI cost, you couldn't do a PFI project. That was the way it was supposed to work. Now, what is meant by optimism bias? I mean, this is quite an important concept in public procurement as well as PPPs. It's the tendency of the public sector to underestimate in public sector contracts the cost of construction and operation and the time to complete and so forth. Most of those risks are transferred to the private sector. Why is there optimism bias in the public sector? Well, actually, you may need to use optimism bias as a public sector official to get approval for the project anyway. You may deliberately, or perhaps not deliberately, but you're not too careful about estimating the costs. Because if you try to be really tough about estimating the costs, the government is not going to approve the project. And yet you know the project has got to be built as an official. So you will tend to underestimate the costs. And if you get it wrong, as a public sector official, you're not you don't usually suffer very much from that. The sanction for getting it wrong is not usually that great. You don't usually get sacked. It's not like the private sector, where if you get it wrong, you will get sacked. Public sector doesn't usually work like that. So there is still optimism bias, even if one's talking about a PFI project, because you will still tend to underestimate the cost of the PFI project. But that just gets hidden within the initial calculations. But of course, this is very problematic. You're comparing the cash flow of an actual PFI project with a theoretical public procurement in which you don't really have any data. A lot of guesswork. And in the real world at this time, if you wanted to build a new hospital, the choice was not between PFI and a public sector procurement. It was between PFI and no project. There was no money in the budget for a public sector procurement. So you had to come out with the right answer in the public sector comparator. So of course, there was a temptation to manipulate the figures, especially as to risk transfer. And at the time, everyone knew the figures were fixed. What used to happen was that you would employ accountants to do the calculations. They'd come up with the first calculation, and if the calculation was wrong, oh, we just need to reassess the amount of risk transfer. I think you need to look at this point and this point. Don't you think the risk transfer figures are too high in this case? And you get the right answer. Also, there was another issue that distorted the answers, which was you're comparing two future cash flows. So to compare the two, you need to discount them to a net present value. And of course, the discount rate that you use very much affects that calculation. The higher the discount rate, the lower the net present value of the PFI contract, because as compared to public procurement, because public procurement, you're spending a lot of money at the beginning and less money later on. Whereas in a PPP contract, you're spending money evenly over the life of the contract. And therefore, the more you discount it, the lower the net present value of that long-term cash flow. So there's a bias in favor of a PPP contract by using a high discount rate. Now, what most governments use as the discount rate that do this kind of calculation, and other governments do it, the Australian, Canadian governments do, for example, they use the cost of government debt, which is a relatively low figure. But in fact, I won't go into the detail, but a relatively high figure was used in the UK. But the problem was that the politicians believed in these value for money calculations. And they kept asserting that the public sector comparator gave a true comparison between public procurement and the PFI routes. And of course, it was very easy to discredit this and so undermine the case for the PFI model. And that's, of course, what happened. And it began really with academic study of PPPs. Now, when I was first writing the book, the first edition of the book, which you are now going to start, not this one, but the PPP book, which you're now going to start translating, which was about 2004, there was very little academic study of PPPs. Like the project finance book, I was writing it not really as an academic book, but as a book just reflecting my own practical experience in dealing with this sector. And in fact, it came as a surprise to me, even after I wrote the project finance book, that the academic market took up the book. And there are literally, must be several thousand people now who've now done their PhDs using these books, to my considerable surprise, as it may come as a surprise to you, but I don't have a PhD. So, you know, I've said to people who've said to me, oh, you know, thanks to your book, I got my PhD. And I said to them, well, I think you should give me your PhD certificate. So anyway, there was very little study. There were a few studies from the World Bank. There were a few studies from the European Investment Bank, which has started to look at it, but there was almost nothing. And it was really about the 2000s that academic study began, and particularly in Britain, studied by a number of quite I would have to say left-wing academics who were against this whole idea of private sector money being involved in public sector projects. They were, of course, right to attack the whole risk transfer thing as being too subjective. That was a correct attack. But there were also some quite confused claims too. For example, that PFI was really, really expensive. And I saw this in myself, that they would produce calculations about how expensive PFI was, but they were including the whole maintenance costs as well as the financing costs. Whereas in the public sector procurement, they would forget about the maintenance costs when they would just do the cost of building it and the cost of government debt. So you were comparing two different things. I saw another study by one British academic of the Spanish motorway system, where she had said that the Spanish government was paying twice for these motorways. It was basically she'd misunderstood the way in which they accounted for the motorways. She'd mixed up depreciation with a payment. And just, I did point this out. She never even replied to my email. But anyway, but also there were other broader criticisms that there was no such thing as risk transfer in PPPs. The expression was used, privatizing profits while socializing losses. The argument being that if a PPP goes wrong, the government has to pick up the pieces. Now, that's not really true if it's done right. We've had PPPs that have gone wrong in the UK. And for the most part, it's the private sector that has had to pick up the pieces. The investors have lost their money. The lenders may well have lost some of their debt as well. And this private sector capital at risk is a very important argument for PPPs because it protects the public sector. Lenders in particular, usually if something goes wrong with a project, the investors have lost all their equity in the project. But lenders, if the project, as it does, usually has some value, they'll want to try and protect that value so they can get at least some of their debt back. So they'll sort out the problem. We have some issues at the moment with some of the waste projects I'm dealing with, where it's quite likely that there are going to be defaults on these projects. And one thing I've been saying to these are local governments who are dealing with these projects is that you can go and talk to the lenders, tell them this is a private sector problem. You have got to sort out this problem. We are not going to sort out this problem for you. It is your job. And they know that. They will try and persuade the public sector to try and do things to help them, but the public sector is not going to do things to help them. It's not going to make the contract easier or anything like that, precisely because it's the private sector's problem. So, I think that argument is not a strong argument. I mean, there are cases where you have really extreme mess up, where you may have, in the end, the public sector may have to take over, but these are very, very unusual. And the other thing is the basic opposition, which is shown by the slogan private service, public service, private profit. It's just an ideological opposition to the idea of private sector finance being used for a public sector service. It also is something that unions tend to oppose, not only for that reason, but also because it does tend to result or may result in staff being transferred from the public sector to the private sector. Now, if you take schools or hospitals, the teaching staff or the medical staff are not transferred to the private sector. These remain public sector organizations. But the buildings and the building staff are transferred to the private sector. So the cleaning staff, for example, are private sector. And unions don't like this. Even though, legally speaking, a lot of their rights are protected even when they are transferred to the private sector. So, those are the kind of reasons that opposition kind of grew to PPPs. But then other things started to come up in the PFI project, which caused further bad publicity and therefore further opposition. And the first of these was debt refinancing. Now, the people who are lending money to a PPP are initially lending money to a project that hasn't been built yet. So they're obviously going to be conservative about that. And particularly during this construction phase, they're going to be very careful about how much money they're going to lend. And they're going to require the people providing the equity to provide as much equity as possible. That still means that there's a lot of debt in the project on a project finance basis. I mean, a typical school or hospital, there might be 85% debt and 15% equity. Nonetheless, it's still a fairly cautious approach. Now, once the project is complete and it's operating smoothly, lenders are going to relax. They're going to be prepared to offer better terms, maybe lower interest rates, for example. Or they may be prepared to lend more money because they're more confident about the cash flow. So what this does is, if you refinance the debt at that point by raising more debt, is that you pay off the old debt, and what's left is money that goes straight to the shareholders. And it accelerates their cash flow. And as the shareholders' measure of their cash flow is primarily the internal rate of return, under which the quicker you get the cash back, the higher your rate of return, that's a good thing. I mean, you might think it's odd, why should the investors be better off if they borrow more money? Because normally you're not better off if you borrow more money. But the point is you're accelerating the receipt of the money that you're going to get. So even though in the long run you get less money because you're paying more interest on the debt, you're still better off in terms of getting the money more quickly. But from a publicity point of view, this is disastrous, because these investors are supposed to be long-term investors. They're supposed to be investing and getting a steady return over 25 years, and suddenly they get a large amount of money only 3, 4, 5 years after they sign the contract. And there were MPs in Parliament, members of Parliament at that time, who were calling this the unacceptable face of capitalism, to give you an idea of the kind of publicity. Now, this was sort of remedied because the industry recognized they'd have to do something about this, because otherwise it was going to, I'm now talking about early 2000s, so quite early on. The industry recognized they'd have to do something about this, or it would just kill the PFI program. So what happened was that a system was introduced where the so-called refinancing gain, this lump of money, was split between the public and private sectors. And actually, that was my first job as a consultant for the government. I actually worked out the formula for doing this, which went into the standard contract at that time. So that kind of calmed some of the publicity, although it didn't completely do away with it. There were still problems in that area. Now, when I was actually doing this at the time, I said to the people in the Treasury, well, that's all very well, but you do realize there's another problem that is going to come up that's very similar, which is sale of the equity at about the same time, for a similar reason, that investors who are going to invest in a project that hasn't been built yet are going to be conservative. So they're going to want a high rate of return to reflect the fact they're taking a high risk. But once the project is completed, the risks are much less. So you can now sell it to a new investor who's very happy to accept a lower rate of return, which means you can sell the equity at a premium. So in the same way, you can walk away with a large profit, a very large profit actually, on your original equity, the way it worked out. You could easily make a 50% profit on the original equity by doing this. It's perfectly legitimate. It just reflects different discount rates. That's all it reflects. And I said to the Treasury at the time, this is going to come up and you'll have further bad publicity, which there was. It took longer. In 2010, they tried to remedy this by the public sector taking an equity share. It just didn't work out very well, and it was eventually dropped when PFI as a whole was being dropped. Then there were problems in procurement early on. Basically, what tended to happen was you chose a preferred bidder. That was almost the beginning rather than the end of the negotiation process. So it was very badly handled. It was really bad procurement, basically. So you could have procurements that went on for, I was involved in some that went on for, 2 years after the preferred bidder was chosen. Now, I know I've seen, I don't know how it works in Brazil, but I've seen in Spain, for example, that under the civil law system, this tends to be rather more efficient. That certainly under the Spanish system, the public authority sends out the contract to people before they bid and says, if you want any changes, you better tell me now, because you're not going to make any changes after you've made the bid. And that's, of course, a much better system. Again, of course, it created very bad publicity. What happened was that at that time, Britain was still in the European Union, and European Union law was tightened up to try and reduce this problem. It was still left open for the British system of some degree of what was called clarification after the preferred bidder was chosen, not negotiation, but clarification. And that still continues, but on the whole, that has improved the negotiation period. But again, bad publicity. And there were all kinds of other issues, some of them not necessarily public, but some of them were public. One of them was that the standard form of contract went through a total of 4 revisions and 1 more draft revision over the years based on experience, but the revisions were patchwork. They would revise, for example, as I mentioned, they'd put in new provisions about sharing the refinancing gain in the 2002 version of that contract. But they didn't step back and say, what has our overall experience been in these contracts? How should we make wider changes in these contracts? Even though I and others at that time tried to persuade them, they just didn't want to spend the money on it, basically. So the contract became more and more full of holes, basically. There were a lot of holes. I could go into detail about this, but I think we haven't got time for that. But it's linked to the fact, of course, that these, like any contract of this size and complexity and this long term, these are incomplete contracts. You just can't think of everything in advance. So inevitably, there will be some holes in the contract. And that, again, under the common law is a very difficult thing to deal with. I think it's perhaps easier under the civil law, but under the common law, the contract is the contract, and what the parties intended is not really taken very much into account. Nor is there any kind of legal framework for PPPs, and therefore it's only the contract that counts. Then the government also got, in the early days, a bit too ambitious. And a prime example of this was the PPP to upgrade and maintain the whole London Underground system, which was being negotiated just about the year 2000. Now, if you think about the London Underground system, I mean, this is a very old system. The earliest London Underground station was built in 1862. The tunnels, the deep tunnels, because as you may know, in London Underground, there are surface tunnels which are similar to the ones that you have here in Sao Paulo, but there are also deeper tunnels that were dug much more deeply and which are quite small. When you go to London Underground and you get on a small train, you're in the very deep tunnels. They were built, at the time, they were built like that because it was the cheapest way of tunneling. But once you start tunneling with a small tunnel, you've got to carry on tunneling with a small tunnel. You haven't got any choice. So you have tunnels that were, 100 years or more old. Nobody had a detailed understanding of the condition of these tunnels. It was too complex. I was actually, I and a lawyer consultant colleague were actually asked in the year 2000 to do a review of this contract, which was still in the process of negotiation at the time. by the Department of Transport, because London Underground was negotiating, and the Department of Transport wanted to understand where they'd got to and what they were doing. And I and this legal colleague, we drafted a report. We then went to see the lead lawyers. I won't mention their name, but it was one of the biggest London law firms who were negotiating this. And we went with some fear, because we found numerous holes in this contract. And we went to see the partner, and we said, look, we've got this problem and this problem and this problem. We thought they'd say, oh, no, you've got that wrong. And what they said, oh, that's quite interesting. We'll pick that up on the next draft. That was their reaction. But basically, the whole thing was too complex. It was signed, it started up, it fell apart because it was too complicated. So just didn't happen. And then the other thing is the suitability of using the availability model, which is fine for a building and it's kind of fine for a road. But when you move into process plant projects of waste, of which waste is a particular example, doesn't work so well. For example, if you take a waste incinerator, oh no, let me back up. The waste that's being taken to the incinerator has to be processed 100% of the time, whether the incinerator is working or not. So if the incinerator is not working, there has to be a backup plan for the waste to go somewhere else. So availability of the incinerator is not relevant to the contract. But nonetheless, the sort of contract that was being used started out with a kind of availability approach, which just for a number of reasons didn't work too well. Then something else which you maybe haven't got to in Brazil yet, which is handback, the end of the contract. The provisions for the condition of the asset were very vague in the standard contract. So it was unclear what the private sector had to do, or in what condition they had to hand the asset back. Also, even the conditions allowing the public sector to take over were unclear. So, for example, again, this particularly applies in things like waste. The local government would go to the project company and say, right, we'd like all the operating data, please, because we now want to go out and procure a new operator. And the operator would say, oh, no, that's commercially confidential. I can't give you this data. But without the data, it's very difficult to procure a new operator, which, of course, the existing operator knows very well. And better written contracts, that kind of thing is provided for. But in the older contracts, and it's the older contracts which are coming along now, you have these gaps. So, that kind of problem as well. It doesn't get publicized, but nonetheless, there's a problem. And then you've got, of course, questions of viability of PFI contracts, because for various reasons they can become unviable for the public sector. And the first and the commonest problem is that you've got a fixed obligation year by year to pay for this PPP. And you've got a budget, which maybe is being squeezed by the government. But you can't squeeze the PPP budget, so you've got to squeeze the other budget. So you get a kind of acceleration effect on the rest of the budget. A prime example of this was actually in Portugal, where the European Investment Bank went a bit mad financing roads in Portugal. Some of them were concession roads, which had their problems, but they were okay. But typically, if you look at Portugal, it's a long, thin country. So the heavily used roads, as I'm sure many of you have been in Portugal, the heavily used roads are going north-south. So that's fine. You can charge tolls on those roads. But the roads that are not heavily used are going the other way, and you can't charge tolls on those roads. So those roads were done on an availability basis. But they did so many of these roads that the government's road budget ended up almost be entirely devoted to these availability roads. So they then had a very difficult renegotiation where they tried to toll the roads, I think some of them are now told, and tried to introduce other changes to try and make these actually financially affordable for the government. So, I mean, that was an extreme case, and it was partly the fault of the European Investment Bank being just too, well, it happened that the person in charge of the Portuguese desk was Portuguese, and he got a bit patriotic, I think, and he kind of overdid the lending without considering the effect. But there are other problems. I mean, one problem is that if you take a typical availability project for a school or a hospital, if the service is not being provided, if, for example, a schoolroom is not available for some reason, maybe the roof is leaking, then there would normally be a deduction in the contract to allow for this not being available. And there's a system of what are called key performance indicators, where there are points taken off and deductions for these as well. So that suppose a light bulb goes and the people servicing are too slow to come and replace the light bulb, they get some points against them. Eventually, if they lose enough points, there will be deductions. But what happened with the PFI system is that, and this was mainly a lender issue, the lenders wanted limits on these deductions. They didn't want the deductions to be so high that they would endanger the debt service. So the limit was typically 10% of the service payment. So if you got a project that's performing really badly, you couldn't make enough deductions because of this 10% limit. And this affected the waste market, because in the waste market, you can certainly get projects performing extremely badly. And in fact, the largest single waste project, which was for the city of Manchester, they eventually had to terminate it because it was performing so badly, they couldn't make enough deductions. It was too expensive for them. So they had to pay a lot of money for termination, but termination was cheaper than continuing because of this limit on deductions. Absolute disaster, but it was partly also a bad procurement as well. But that was another problem. So you've got that problem. Then, of course, you get changes in the public sector requirements. Let's say you've got 10 schools, and because of a change in population, you don't need one of the schools. It's difficult to make that kind of change in this kind of contract. And again, expensive. Because the investors still want their profits, lenders still want to be repaid. And also, if you try and change the contract too much, certainly under the British system, can actually raise procurement issues. That is, somebody who lost on the original procurement can come along and say, oh, now you're making changes in this contract. You didn't tell me you were going to do this. And they can actually get damages from the public sector if it's shown that they could have met these requirements at the time. Of course, you can terminate the contract. There is a right to terminate the contract in all the PFI contracts. But again, it's very expensive. You've got to pay off the lenders, and you've got to compensate for the private sector's loss of profit. So usually termination, unless in this kind of extreme situation in Manchester that I mentioned, it's too expensive. So you just can't do it. So you're kind of stuck with it. Equally, though, on the private sector side, I don't know how much you've seen this in Brazil, but certainly in the UK, we've seen PFI contracts becoming unviable for the private sector with resulting defaults. All kinds of things have happened. One is miscalculations in bid pricing. I mean, surprising as it may seem, we actually had a very notorious case again in the waste sector where one bidder bid a price that was significantly lower than all the other bidders. Now, what the public authority should have done in that case is said, why are they significantly lower? Because basically, when you get down to a shortlisted list of bidders, 2 or 3 bidders, they should be all about the same price. There shouldn't be a big difference between them. But of course, the local government being, of course, blind to these things, oh, they're much cheaper. They took that one. What had happened, it was actually a Spanish company. They had made a mistake in the bidding. They had actually mixed up a European measurement with a British measurement. And as a result, it was impossible for this plant to operate. You could only operate at about half the capacity that it was supposed to operate. They did their best to confuse the local government, who, to give them their merit, were not confused. It went to court. The judge, I mean, the judgment is actually hilarious. I mean, if any of you are interested in reading it, you can read it. I'll send it to you. Because, of course, the engineer in charge, he was only a 20-something-year-old. He didn't even have any senior people. Engineer in charge was sending emails saying, yeah, well, I'm going to try and bullshit them. And, of course, all these emails appeared in court. So the judge just tore them apart. So there you go. And in fact, they had very, very good lawyers. Again, a big city firm who completely tore apart the private sector. And in fact, in that case, it was terminated. But far from the private sector paying anything, actually, the public sector paying anything, the private sector were so frightened of the lawyers, they eventually actually paid to demolish the plant, paid them £10 million in damages as well. So anyway, another issue is failure to meet specifications. That again can happen in the waste sector, but it happened in other sectors. A very famous early case was a contractor who was building the government standards institute, where they do very exact measurements. So, for example, you're measuring a temperature to the nearest half degree, but if someone opens the door, the temperature in the room goes up by 2 degrees, and you've got to be able to manage this in the building. And the contractor could not build the building to the required specification. In fact, eventually went bankrupt partly as a result of this. So you get that kind of thing. You get delays in completion, which lead to loss of revenue, and therefore, again, affect the sorry, am I taking too long? No. Affect the tell me if I'm taking too long. Affect the well, I can say I could easily stay all night, yes, but I think affect the viability of the project. So we've had a number of cases where construction subcontractors have gone insolvent in the middle of construction. So you've got to find a new contractor, very difficult and very expensive. But as I said earlier, it's the private sector's problem. And the lenders usually, sometimes the investors have gone out, found a contractor, paid them more money, and built the building. There's usually a delay, and they suffer from that too, because of course the public sector doesn't pay until it's completed, but it's been done. But also you can get a situation with these subcontracts that I mentioned earlier, not just the construction subcontract, but also the management subcontract can also become unprofitable. And we actually have, again, situations like that in the waste sector at the moment, where we have, and I mean, it's public knowledge, I won't mention names, but I mean, it's public. There's a major European waste contractor who have a business in the UK, a small number of projects, where they have consistently lost money on the operating side because they mispriced the operations, basically because the operations required far more staff than they originally expected. And they've now said they're going to sell their UK business. I don't believe, and I've said to the local governments concerned, I do not believe that they're going to find a buyer for this business because it's loss-making. It's not a very attractive sector of the waste market. So I don't think anyone's going to buy it. So what's going to happen? They're going to walk away from these contracts. Now, as it happens in these cases, and it's quite important for this type of contract, the operating subcontractor, if he defaults, has to pay damages. And the damages are actually quite substantial in compensation. So that there is a way of dealing with this, because you can get at the operating subcontractor who's guaranteed by the parent company. So for this type of project, it's actually quite important to put this kind of thing in. I mean, in a building project, it's not so important because, you know, if the building's built, fine, you know, there isn't going to be a problem. But if you have a project like a waste project where you're not going to find another operator at the same price because it's too expensive, it's important that he pays damages in that situation. And then you can sort it out. I mean, this has happened already. And what happened was that a deal was done. The lenders lost some of their money. The public authority paid the lenders back. but they paid them back only about half their debt. So they got it back cheaply. As a result, they could operate it. They were paying less in debt payment through the service charge, and therefore they could afford to pay more through operating costs. So they could afford to kind of continue operating at about the same price. They took over operation themselves, in fact, in this case, in the case that's already happened. And at the same time, the operating subcontractor's parent paid the lenders the default amount. That actually paid off the lenders in full. The equity was completely lost, but the equity was owned by the waste contractor anyway, so he didn't care. so that's quite an important lesson actually for this type of contract, and that's the way that, as I think is likely, and as I've already been saying to the local governments concerned, I think that's the way we're going to go with all these contracts. I think they're going to walk away in a few months, or start threatening to walk away, and they're going to try and persuade you to pay them more money because they're going to threaten you, and you're just going to say, no, we're not going to do that. Actually, we can't do that because it raises procurement issues anyway, and we're going to reach a deal. So, but again, paradoxically, this sort of thing leads to bad publicity. It's seen as a failure by PFI if halfway through the construction the contractor defaults, even though it's not a failure. It actually shows that you've transferred risk to the private sector, and the building has still got built, and the public sector is still paying the same for it. But nonetheless, because the press and the politicians too didn't properly understand these issues, it was seen as a failure of PFI. And there was some very spectacular failures. One big contractor in particular who did a lot of government contracting, not just in PFI, failed. And this was a big issue. PFI was seen as somehow involved in all this, which it wasn't. The same thing would have happened if this same contractor had been building hospitals as it was for the public sector. It would have failed as well. But, there you go. It's worth just also noting what happens where a default occurs, because this is again an area where there's actually a huge hole potential in certain sectors in the standard PFI contract. What happens where a contractor defaults on a PFI contract? There are two alternatives, and the first one was a completely new concept that was introduced in 1999 in the first contract, which is that you auction the contract in the market. Whatever anyone pays for it is paid to the existing contractor. So if they pay nothing, if they think it's worth nothing, the existing contractor is paid nothing. If they pay him half of the net future value of the contract, or what he thinks is the net future value of the contract, that's what he gets. It's a great concept, but the lenders were quite unhappy about it, and they introduced, I won't go into the details, but they introduced provisions into this that kind of negated, is the right word, yeah, the use of this. There's never actually been an auction. Although in some new contracts where I have been giving some advice on this, I said, cut out all this lender stuff, just auction the contract. People were bidders and their lenders are pretty unhappy, but they kind of realized that it was unreasonable to put this stuff in. So it is in some new contracts. So the alternative, and that's the one the lenders go for, is you pay the net present value of the future cash flow that's in the model, less any cost to rectify the asset to make sure it works properly. This is extremely difficult because it leads to huge argument about what are the future operating costs going to be, what is it going to cost to rectify the asset. Also, the public sector is paying up front, even though the asset hasn't yet been rectified. So they're paying on estimates, which is not great. So all in all, it's a very unfavorable situation actually for the public sector. And what makes it worse is in some situations where you go back to the situation where the contractor fails during construction. And because, like in the example of the waste project I gave, because of a bad specification, you can't build it to the required specification. How can you rectify it? It's impossible. And there's actually a hole in the standard contract because nobody thought of this at the time. So there's been one case where this happened to a waste contract some years back. The contractor went bankrupt because he couldn't build it to the required specification. There were, I think, 2 to 3 years of legal argument. Don't ask me what the legal costs were. Great for the lawyers. In the end, a settlement was reached where they still paid a lot of money. But it was a disaster, just absolute disaster, financially speaking. So, that sort of thing just can't go into a contract for that type of asset. So in reality, what generally happens is default leads to a negotiated termination. They do a deal. But even that is difficult because what you can't do is change the contract for the reasons I've already said, because it raises this procurement issue. So you're stuck with the existing contract. So you've probably got to just cancel the existing contract and start again in a negotiation. And that's what tends to happen in that kind of situation. Now, that's a bad thing from the government point of view, because that, from an accounting point of view, that puts the asset back on the public and its debt back on the public sector balance sheet. So government is very averse to cancelling contracts in any situation. Now, in the PFI system, local governments get grants to help them towards paying their service fees for PFI contracts. Now, I am sitting in central government, and central government does not want these contracts cancelled. So what central government does, or what the Treasury does, is it tells the department I work for, the Department of the Environment, that if this project goes back on the public sector balance sheet, you, the Department of the Environment, have to set the net present value of all your future grants against your current budget, this year's budget, which the Department of the Environment cannot afford to do. So the Department of Environment will then tell the local government that if you cancel this project, you will lose all of your grant, which suddenly makes it far more expensive for the local government. Then the local government will sue the central government, which has happened several times, and a lot of money is spent on lawyers. In the end, the central government actually wins in this situation, but nonetheless, you can see what happens. And this is where I have to wear two hats, because I know that it's commercially the most sensible thing to do to cancel the contract. But I also know, indeed, if I say this to the local government, Department of Environment will no longer employ me as a consultant, So I have to be very careful in what I say in this kind of situation. And again, so it's all a bit of a mess when it comes to termination. I think it's probably the simple way of putting it. So what's the effect of all this? Well, here's a little graph that appeared in the Financial Times a few months ago, showing the investment in the National Health Service, which is the hospital service. And you can see what happened in 2010 when PFI hospitals stopped. It's obvious. And that's not just, in fairness, it's not just PFI hospitals. It was after the 08-09 financial crisis. So, of course, there was a austerity and a squeeze on budgets anyway. But nonetheless, PFI was certainly a good part of this. And what happened? Capital funding for hospitals, for example, was diverted to meet short-term maintenance. And the maintenance backlog, because there wasn't enough capital funding, it actually doubled. Even in 1 year, it's doubled from £10 billion in 1 year, 2 years, from 2021 to 2023. It's now a massive problem in the hospital sector, not just in the hospital sector, is this backlog in maintenance. But of course, there's no backlog of maintenance on PFI hospitals. They're all being maintained. It's fine. It may be bad for their budget, but they're all being maintained. And had PFI hospitals continued, they would have had to find the budget to keep doing the maintenance. And of course, not doing maintenance is the most expensive way of borrowing from the future. It's far more expensive than borrowing money, because you don't maintain things and they get worse and worse and worse and more expensive, and then you have inflation and everything else.
Ned, just a quick question. They delegate the doctors too, or just the building, the ONM?
No. Under the, I mean, it varies from country to country, but in Britain it is only the building, So the doctors, the managers, or the managers of the building, the National Health Service management, the cleaning staff, the security staff, everybody else. These are all. I beg your pardon. Let me start again. The medical services remain public sector. The non-medical services, which includes things like cleaning and so forth, can be part of the PFI, or they can be under a separate maintenance contract. In fact, now the tendency is actually to separate the maintenance contract from the PFI contract, because the maintenance contract is inherently short-term. It's like a 7-year contract, not a 25-year contract. So you should separate the two. Yeah, but there are some other countries where this didn't happen. I mean, you may be interested to look at a case study I did. I did a book of case studies for an NGO in Africa on PPPs in sub-Saharan Africa. And this particular case study related to a hospital in Lesotho, which is a little tiny country in the middle of South Africa, which was set up basically by IFC, International Finance Corporation, which is part of the World Bank. They had a problem there that most of their patients basically had to, who had any kind of serious illness, like, for example, they needed dialysis or they needed cancer treatment, they had to travel to South Africa, because the hospital in Lesotho, which was a very old hospital, didn't have these services. And it's a ride of several hours. I mean, I've driven that particular drive. It's a ride of several hours. And you can imagine, I mean, I have kidney problems. I haven't yet had dialysis, but I would not like to drive several hours for dialysis, 3 times a week. So the IFC sold this idea to the Ministry of Health in Lesotho, that they should ask people to bid to not only build a new hospital, but also to operate the new hospital. They had very few bidders because people could see this was going to be very difficult. This was a country that didn't have a very good public sector budget. Its main public sector budget actually depended on being part of the, what I think was called SADC, which stands for South Africa Development Corporation. And they got most of their budget through SADC from a share of customs duties, from things mainly from goods crossing the South African border. So of course, if you have a recession, you suddenly lose a big part of your budget. But anyway, it was sold to them by IFC. And I can tell you, having talked to people in the Ministry of Health, they didn't really understand what they were doing. And this wonderful new hospital was built by a major South African operator of hospitals, private sector, a lot of private sector hospitals in South Africa. So of course they did a wonderful job, but of course it was far too expensive. And in the end, the Ministry of Health cancelled the contract. They didn't know what they were doing. They just cancelled the contract. And the main lender was, in fact, the South African government. It was the South African Development Corporation. I can't remember its exact name. And I think probably the South African government have said, well, we'll just kind of forget about this. But it's still a mess. I mean, I still follow what's happened. I mean, as soon as the local government took over, they suddenly employed twice as many people who were all their friends and relations. And of course, it got even more expensive. You know, and you can imagine, you know, but you know, I had major criticisms at the time. It was quite funny because IFC originally ignored me, and then when they realized what I was doing, suddenly they couldn't give me enough information. You know, they were, you know, do you need to know any more? Do you need to meet so and so? Do you need to meet so and so? Because they suddenly realized that what happened was that originally Oxfam, who were, you know, the NGO, had written a very adverse report on this. I went to see the person in Oxfam who had written this. They didn't fully understand the issues, but nonetheless, it was a very adverse report. So the hospital people refused to talk to me because they didn't want to talk to anybody after the Oxfam report. But eventually, as I said, IFC did. But nonetheless, I mean, my main criticisms were firstly that they should have separated the medical services from the building. The whole thing would have been much easier if they'd done that. They could have renegotiated the medical services contract, for example. And they could have controlled the medical services contract much better. The problem was they couldn't control everything. There was too much. They just couldn't do it. And they got no help. And then of course there was the whole budget issue. I didn't fully appreciate how bad the budget issue was because it only became apparent afterwards. But the whole budget issue eventually just killed the whole thing. So yeah. And the same principle applies in schools, for example. The teaching staff are all public sector. Yeah. Yeah, so I mean, PFI could have done something about this in this kind of situation. So the government, you know, since 2010, the government has spent a lot of time playing around with trying to find some alternative to the idea of PPPs, something else. Now, the regional governments in Wales and in Scotland have actually used the PFI model, but they've called it something else and they pretend it's something else. So in Scotland, it's called the non-profit distributing model, which originally was a model where there was a fixed return for the equity shareholders. They couldn't make these extra profits that I've mentioned. I actually negotiated the first of those for the Scottish government, and I, to a certain extent, I think seemed to have managed to fool the equity investors, which I was quite surprised at. But they soon realized that they'd been fooled, and they then lobbied the government, and you know, that destroyed that idea. So it actually was the same as PFI. And the Welsh government have a thing they call the mutual investment model, where they do actually take a small equity share, and that kind of deflates the publicity a bit, but that doesn't really do very much. So in England, because that, I mean, that's basically, you know, most of the country. In England is 90% of the country. Various different models have been used. One is the regulated asset-based model. This, of course, is an old model, originally American, for regulating utilities. And it's used for privatized utilities in the UK. This has been very heavily criticized, especially for water, because what happened was that basically the private water companies fooled the regulator. They loaded the companies with debt, took out huge dividends, and you know, didn't invest as much as they should have done, et cetera, et cetera. So this has been a big problem. It's now being attempted for nuclear power, but who knows whether that's going to happen. Franchises, you have, of course, the affirmage system, which is, of course, the French system for dealing with utilities, where the investment is done by the main investment is done by the public sector. The main capital investment is done by the public sector. But then utilities are then managed, and sort of minor investment like making connections is done by the private sector. So you've got these large companies like Veolia and Suez, who, you know, whose history is of providing this sort of service of affirmage. And do you have it in Brazil also? Or, yeah. So that was tried not for utilities, but for the railway system. That didn't work either. And it's largely been cancelled now. Well, it eventually collapsed as a result of the pandemic, and suddenly there was a huge drop in the railway traffic. So you know, that kind of finished that one. The government is still really doesn't know what it wants to do in relation to the railways. It's all a bit of a mess. I mean, the answer is to probably follow the Japanese model and privatize them properly, which, you know, has worked well in Japan. Then also in railways, operating leases, which has been used on railways for railway rolling stock. It's also used in Germany, actually, for railway rolling stock. But the problem about that is these are quite short-term. If they're linked to franchises, they're quite short-term. So you can have a 25-year lease with a 7-year franchise. So what's going to happen at the end of the franchise? The government has to give guarantees about the use after the end of the franchise, which I think also happens in Germany. So, you know, that's not a lot of use, really. You've got what was originally called I'm coming to the end. I'm coming to the end, yeah. I think I've got about one and a bit more slides. Okay. I'm getting there. I'm nearly there. I'm nearly there. You've got you've got what was previously called, and still is, I think, called private partnerships in the US, which is real estate developer finance. So you've got a school that has a large amount of ground. So you say to the real estate developer, okay, you can build a block of apartments over here, but build me a new school over here. So you can still use that kind of thing. It's not a PPP in the sense we're talking about. There's no long-term contract. It's just a public building. So the government still needs private sector capital for infrastructure. There's no doubt about that. But it's struggling at the moment because of the fact that PFI is poisonous. Finding an alternative is proving almost impossible, actually. And yet it's absurd because the vast majority of PFI projects completed on time, on budget, to specification. They continue to be maintained properly. The users love the assets. They have no problems with them. Unlike public sector projects where none of these things tend to apply. So Britain's been too quick to throw out this model. And experience suggests that this is a model which has got a role to play. It may be that eventually it'll be the next government, not this government, and we're almost certain to have a change of government next year to the left, which means there'll be more against this. They may be forced to try it. Time will tell. So there we are, a bit of advertising, which you know about it already. That's all I have to say on the subject. Well, not all, but we have to stop at this point.
That's it was amazing. Thank you so much. You enlightened us.
My pleasure, my pleasure.
With your words, and it's like a course, you know, of infrastructure. Actually, it's more than a lecture. Thank you so much. I will open for some questions for the audience or something, or the people that are virtual. Querem fazer alguma pergunta?
Or you may have experience in Brazil that is kind of parallel to this.
Yes. That's great. Temos alguma pergunta do virtual, Dani? Aí não estou acompanhando aqui. Eu tenho várias aqui. Quer começar, Renan?
There's something that I would like to share. We have one hospital here in Brazil, which is deemed to be the best public hospital in Brazil. It's called the Hospital do Subúrbio, something like the suburb hospital in the state of Bahia. It's the only case in Brazil where the medical services are part of the PPP. And it's been, it was prized many times for being the best public hospital in Brazil. But we still face a lot of resistance, especially from politicians to bundle the medical services with the infrastructure services. So it's the only case in Brazil. We have many other social infrastructure PPPs that are centered on the infrastructure provision, but they all fare well. And you mentioned the difficulties of negotiating contracts. We've had a bill passed, I guess, in 2018 about retendering failed contracts, failed by the private initiative. And it goes across sectors. We have 4 or 5 airports being retendered, roads, and we could name a lot of contracts that failed because of the optimist bias and other risks that should have been borne by the private partner. but something went wrong, and now the government has to tender again to try and save those contracts from being canceled. So we do have our share of problems here too.
Yeah, although, I mean, just to pick up the last point, even in Brazil, following international accounting standards, once you've retendered those projects, they are supposed to appear on the government balance sheet. Whether they do, I don't know, but they are supposed to. And under World Bank, IMF standard, they are supposed to appear on the government balance sheet.
Actually, since we are Brazil signed off for IPSIS, all PPP contracts, all PPP contracts are to be shown in government budget, each and every one of them.
Oh, okay. Right.
But what we don't do in Brazil, and we should do, there is a legal thing that government should do, is to care about telling auditing offices what are the contingent liabilities of these contracts. That's something that nobody knows.
Which is done in the UK.
Yes, nobody knows that. No one ever fills that form. There is a specific form that should be filled by the contracting authority, and nobody does that at all. So we have a lot of issues. But there's been a lot of evolution in the last 10 years, especially when it comes to structuring and drafting better PPP contracts. But we do have problems on managing them.
I think, one thing you can say to the politicians is, PPP contracts are great because you don't have to find a budget. You can just decree a new hospital, sign a contract, and by the time you're being paid for, you're out of office. So they're great. However, the other thing that I won't say this applies in Brazil, but I do know other countries where it does apply. Another reason politicians are against PPP contracts is it's much more difficult for a little bit of money to flow into the politician's pocket if it's a PPP contract than if it's a public procurement.
Ned, let me, I want to hear you about some broad view about the problems in Brazil and abroad. In Brazil, we invest like 2% our GDP in infrastructure.
And how much of that is in PPPs, do you know?
It's going to be, today we have more investments in the private sector to the public sector. It's like 60% from the private and the rest from the public sector. So in this amount, it counts like 60% from the private and 40% from the public sector. If you talk about this 2%, and
that's a very high private sector figure.
Yes.
I mean, the rule of thumb, which applied in Britain and it applied, I know, in Korea, for example, was that specifically in relation to PPPs, this relates to, however, to a budget, not to an annual budget. PPP should not be more than 10% of the annual infrastructure budget.
Oh yeah. Oh, so we are very
well, but that's not quite the same thing as the figure you were saying.
Okay, yeah.
So the question would be, what percent of the annual Brazilian infrastructure budget is PPPs, where the public sector, of course, is
Okay.
paying?
5%.
Yeah.
Okay.
5%.
5%.
Okay. So in which case you still have room, actually.
Yeah, because in the 60%, there's all kinds of concessions and PPPs models. That's perfect. Yeah.
And it's widely acknowledged, and many people tend to say that our PPP legislative act learned from Portugal because of what happened there. They made a lot of road PPPs, and they tried to hit it from the balance sheet, and then all the risks came to be. So many people say that when the politicians went to write down the bill, they learned from Portugal and they put that limit. So,
but how do you know if it's 5% if you don't have any?
Oh, it's 5%.
Well, I suppose in the annual budget you can.
It's 5% from the annual projection of tax of tax collection.
And then, Ned, of course, we have a private sector investing. so we have a fiscal crisis here in Brazil because, not just in Brazil, in the whole world. So we need, of course, the private sector to make like a convergence with the public sector to invest in infrastructure, social services, and etc. But the problem is that the legal safeguards in Brazil are actually a tough thing, not only in the planning of the structuring of the projects, but when the regulators need some kind of action, to balance the contract with all, especially when happened events like COVID-19. We don't have any decision about COVID that impacts concessions contracts in Brazil still now. And it's a huge problem because all the contracts are with some kind of difficulty in terms of balance, economic balance. And then, of course, like as you said, this is our incomplete contract, so we need to have a strong regulation about it. So I have two questions for you. Do you think in developing countries like Brazil, PPPs are one of the best ways to go to develop infrastructure? And the second question is about regulation. We have contractual regulation, discretionary regulation here, as it's not the same as in the common law, but it's a little bit, a theory. And we have to get efficiency from the regulators. And we don't feel that. So the private sector stays a little bit down about all the investments that they are due. What do you think it's possible to do to have a better regulation for attempt, to legal safeguards that we need as we invest a lot of money in this kind of contracts?
Well, I mean, that's your first question. Are PPP suitable for a developing country? Well, I've spent quite a bit of time in Africa, and there are virtually no social sector PPPs. Nobody's used government-paid PPPs in Africa. This hospital in Lesotho, IFC thought it would be the beginning of a big, sort of surge of PPP hospitals in Africa. It has not happened. There are almost none. What happens in Africa is concessions. Yeah, you can get toll roads, you can get ports, you can get airports, and the problem is that nobody believes the government can pay for them. So what do you do? And even, I mean, let alone, I mean, even in the power sector, for example, countries like Nigeria, the government, you're selling power to the government, and they can't even pay for that. So they're not going to pay for hospitals. So I think it's a very, very difficult issue, I think, unless you have absolute confidence in the government paying. And then your second question makes it worse, because as you rightly pointed out, the common law system is different to the civil law system. And the common law system, if the government signs a contract, the government has to pay. There's no regulators. If the contract says this, you pay. That's it. Now, there are problems about interpreting the contract, as I've mentioned, but nonetheless, you pay. So no one has any concern. For example, even with local governments in Britain, local governments are subject to very tight controls on the amount of money or on their budgets. They get a lot of money from central government. A local government legally cannot go bankrupt in Britain. It must meet its liabilities. If it cannot meet its liabilities, it publishes what is called, I think, a Section 115 notice. And what happens then is the central government sends in commissioners who take over the local government, and they run it until they've got it back into a stable financial situation. And because of the recent austerity in recent years, a number of cities, including the city of Birmingham, which is one of the main cities, is now being run by government commissioners. It means that suddenly a lot of services are lost because they're cut out and things like that. So, but what it means is a lender to the city of Birmingham is worried because he knows he'll get paid back. The debt gets paid. People talk about the debt being renegotiated. But there's no question of that happening. Legally speaking, it can't happen. So you are very safe. And equally, a PPP is no different to any other debt. You're very safe in lending to the government. So if you could trust the government to pay you back, you could enter into PPPs. If you can't trust the government to pay you back, and if the government has got regulators who it appoints, I presume, and who have powers to go beyond the contract, then you've got a problem. So unless you can cut down these regulators' powers such that they can only work to a large extent according to what the contract says, but that is, I think, a very fundamental issue in civil law anyway, because as far as I understand it, in civil law, in a contract, you're allowed much more than is the case. You know, for example, I have a case at the moment where there is a PFI contract where it is quite clear that there was a mistake in the contract, in the insurance provision. It is quite clear this was a mistake. But I'm waiting actually for a legal opinion, but I'm pretty sure that legal opinion is going to say it doesn't matter, it's a mistake. It's what the contract says. Never mind, it's a mistake. And that's the situation under common law. There are advantages and disadvantages with that, but that's the situation. And the civil law, I think you would be able to go behind that and say this was not what the parties intended. This was a mistake. But I think it's generally said that actually the civil law is not a good framework for PPP contracts or concession contracts, precisely because investors and lenders who are international investors and lenders mainly come from a common law background. And they want to have the kind of security they have in investing in a common law-based PPP or concession. And they're not too happy about, even in a country like France, okay, it's easy because you can get French investors. But I mean, they have, the same kind of PPPs in France. I think you will see less presence in France from the non-civil law countries, precisely because they're less comfortable with the way PPPs work in France. So, there's a problem there. I don't know what the answer to that problem is, other than kill the regulators. But even if you kill the regulators, you've still got a problem. As I'm saying, in civil law, as I understand it.
For us as advisors, we are in trouble when we have to pick up the budget, the law, and then make the guarantees, for the private sector in this kind of administrative concession that is said. So it's very hard, especially when we talk about social infrastructure, because there's some amounts of money that are directly destination, and you can change, because of the law. So this is something that it's our legal framework. It's hard to deal with.
I mean, even in the common law, there are some countries. I mean, I spent some time advising the Tanzanian government, and they passed a PPP law. Now, they didn't need to, and this was a bad thing to do, because they passed the law, and when I read the law, I said, well, this is going to be a problem because you put this provision in here. It's not going to work in a PPP contract, and now you've got to change it. In fact, when I was in banking, we did the first PPP in Greece, which was a concession for a bridge, which required a specific act of the Greek Parliament, and they had to amend that act. Well, it had to go through Parliament 3 times, because they passed the law first of all. Then the investors came along and said, oh, no, we've got to change this bit and this bit. So they had to change it. And then the lenders came along and said the same thing. So they had to go and change it again. So, I mean, it took quite some years to even get the law straight. So, I mean, that's the problem with passing laws for PPPs. Now, in South Africa, which, although it has a Roman law system, it also has a kind of common law system as well. The public sector has the power to sign these contracts. There is no PPP law in South Africa, but the South African Treasury just published regulations which it can easily change. This is subsidiary legislation, which it can easily change. And then under these regulations, it then published in effect a framework. The way it was supposed to about the way it's supposed to work. So Yeah, I mean, literally. I mean, and in fact, in Tanzania, they published both the law and the regulations at the same time. And they were both full of all kinds of problems. And I literally sat down with a meeting with the people in the PPP unit, and we're going through, no, that's no good, that's no good, that's no good. And they said, oh, well, look, let's go and have lunch. So we went off to have lunch, and we continued. And as we were continuing, an MP walked past us, and the head of the PPP unit said, look, you're going to have to make a lot of changes here, you know. So passing laws for PPPs is not a good idea because you know, they can have the wrong kind of detail in them.
Se alguém quiser perguntar e não quiser falar em inglês, pergunta que eu traduzo para ele. Alguém?
Fique à vontade. Eu tenho uma pergunta aqui. I have a question from the audience, but the virtual audience. Ah, tem uma pergunta? Ah, não, depois a gente já fala. Fala, Manolinho. We are talking about infrastructure, and he said that it's a lot of traffic here in Brazil, especially in São Paulo. What do you think about?
Well, actually, we were talking about this in the taxi, and my answer is easy: get rid of the cars.
Yeah.
Look at London now; we've got rid of a lot of the cars. You have to pay to go into the center of London. Now, okay, we have also. I mean, you have a good public transport system in São Paulo. You have a good metro.
Yes,
you have a bus system. You know, force people to use the system. And okay, it's a pretty crowded system. I actually tried it today, so I also found out I could travel for nothing, which is great. Yeah, just get rid of the cars.
We're gonna be with the president of Metro on Friday. He's gonna be with us.
Build more metro lines.
Yeah.
And get rid of the cars.
Yeah.
and get some private sector money to do it, maybe.
Tem pergunta da plateia?
Tem uma pergunta, mas pode fazer.
I'll leave you with two questions, but you can leave them for last. One, there's been a lot of debate ever since the pandemic, and no one quite knows how to determine whether or not the pandemics should be treated as force majeure. So I want to know what's your view on it. And when we are wrapping up to finish today, I would like some comment on what are the lessons learned from PFI that you would share with us so we won't make the same mistakes.
Okay, the force majeure question is very simple. In PFI, the definition of force majeure is extremely narrow.
Mm-hmm.
It only includes things like nuclear explosions.
Oh my God.
You cannot use force majeure in the normal broad sense in a PFI contract. Why? Because you should be able to insure against it.
Mm-hmm.
And your insurance should cover the issue.
Yeah.
So, you know, a school burns down. Fine. You get the insurance to rebuild the school. You also get business interruption insurance, which allows you to keep operating that or to pay for the cost of moving all the pupils to some temporary school in the meantime. So there's no reason for any force majeure in that kind of situation. So yeah, I mean, that's it as far as force majeure is concerned. You just take out insurance. Now there is one exception to that, which is again particularly affecting the waste sector, which is if you cannot get insurance, that is treated as force majeure.
Okay.
And what happens, and the reason, by the way, you can't, that there's increasing difficulty getting insurance in the waste sector is that waste projects have an unfortunate tendency to go on fire, and insurance companies don't like waste projects, and it's getting more and more and more difficult and more and more and more expensive, very expensive, to get insurance for waste projects. And this is actually a big issue where I actually spend a lot of my time. What happens if force majeure in that situation does happen under a PFI contract? There's two options. Either the public authority has to in effect insure the project. It has the option to do that, take that risk, or it's terminated, and there is a termination provision which is not as expensive as a kind of normal voluntary termination, but you still have to pay off the debt, and you pay a certain amount, but limited amount to the equity. But it's really only in the insurance situation. So yeah, nothing about force majeure. As to lessons learned, well, I mean, the main lessons learned is if the politicians don't understand it, and if the press doesn't understand it, and the publicity goes wrong, it kills the program.
Yeah.
Because that's what's happened. That's what's happened. I mean, there are other lessons about, how do you manage contracts and procurement, but that's the big lesson in relation to the UK. That's, and people in other parts of the world, that I visit are always, if they don't know this, always astonished to hear that they've used the British model in their own country. Yeah. And now they find Britain doesn't want to use this model anymore.
And this reminds me a very important privatization model that it's happening in Brazil right now, that is Sabesp. Sabesp, it's our state-owned company. It's the biggest in Latin America. And the state of São Paulo has like 51% of the shares. And now they are trying to pass a law that will put like 30% or 20%. The government doesn't know it yet, which is the real amount. But the real problem is that ideology comes to arena, And I don't know if you face this kind of trap in UK and here in Brazil, because of political issues, we have two parties fighting again, and we need to see what is the best for the people, for the quality of people to make like social and economic development. And so this is something that for us as professionals in the area is something very wrong and it's not good, for the environment. Well, what are your thoughts about this?
Originally, as I said, that there wasn't an ideological divide between the two main parties on PFI. Originally, the Labour government of Tony Blair, who took over after PFI had started, saw that they were pragmatic. They saw that it was the only way to solve the problem. Or at least they saw it as the only way to solve the problem. So they continued with it, and then paradoxically, it was the Conservative government that came in under David Cameron who then started turning away from this, to the extent, and they kind of forgot that it was their policy, to the extent, I work in as I said, in the kind of within the civil service. And one civil servant told me he went to see the minister about one issue on a PFI contract. And the minister said, "Oh, PFI again, that's that terrible Labour Party policy." This minister was sufficiently young that she'd forgotten or didn't know this was a policy of her own party originally. So yeah, I mean, if you cannot get, and this applies to any kind of people, if you cannot get ideological consensus, you are stuck. You are stuck. So the only way is to try and educate the politicians. If you can persuade them to sit down and listen, and forget about the ideology, just, this is the way it works. Look at all these other countries that are doing this. How do you think these other countries are getting their infrastructure? And take them to other countries that are doing this, not to Britain anymore, but take them to France, take them to Spain, Germany, Italy, they're all doing this. Take them to these countries, and take them to the government people in these countries who are usually quite, ready to, get your embassy to help and everything. Usually quite ready to help. You can go to Britain and you can talk to government there, but it's a bit silly because they're not doing it. So, you just hear the arguments against it. But yeah, education is the only way. It's very difficult, but that's the only way.
Yeah. Oh, I totally agree. Totally agree. I have one question from the audience, Alan Carvalho. That reminds me something that you already put on. There is the negotiation of contracts and the limits of that. Alan said that in Brazil, to avoid the issue of overcommitment with PPP contracts, law establishes a limit of 5% of the net revenue of the government. There is currently a discussion about increasing that limit. What does the professor think of having that kind of legal limit to PPP contracts? And this reminds me the negotiation of or renegotiation of contracts, and which are the limits in UK? Because in Brazil we don't have any law as a civil law. We have a kind of a trouble, because we don't have any law for that. So How can this work?
Well, I mean, there was no law in the UK either, but as I said before, the sort of, insofar as countries looked at this, and a good country to look at is actually Korea, who did a lot of concessions, transport concessions, and then picked up also the British model for social sector as well. So Korea is a good country to look at in this context, and again, I think, you know, I think they're quite happy to receive visitors to talk about this, and they did have a formal limit of 10% of the budget for the payments. And that was the kind of informal British limit as well. And I think there are other countries, I don't know what other countries, but I think there are other countries that also had this. So instead of your 5% limit of the annual budget, 10% limit of the budget was considered to be the kind of prudent maximum limit. So you don't squeeze that for the, you know, like the Portuguese reason, you don't squeeze the budget, you know, too much. So I think if 5% is the current limit, it would not be unreasonable to increase it to something more, but 10% is probably the maximum.
Well, Ned, thank you so much. It's a great discussion, great points that you bring to Brazil for our reflection. You know, I think we have some issues that are pretty the same, you know, in the whole world, of course, with some peculiarities, of course. But we feel here in our commission that Brazil needs, you know, to extend the volume of investments, but not the quantity, but the quality, you know, to make life of people better. That's very important. I want you to share your final thoughts, and then we can finish our discussion here today.
Okay, well, I think it is that you know, a lot of the problems are the same all over the world.
Yeah.
And particularly a lot of the problems for developing countries are again the same all over the world. There's no easy answers to these problems. If they were easy, you know, you would have answers. I'm afraid. I think one just has to recognize the problems are there and try to find realistic ways of dealing with these problems. And the biggest problems are in the social sector. Yeah. It's the issue of hospitals and schools and this whole area where you can't charge users. We can't fairly charge users for the full cost of the services, because otherwise the poor can't afford to go to hospital. So there isn't an easy answer, but we have to keep fighting to, you know, to find answers to these things, because, you know, you've got to improve the quality of life for the population, as you already said. That's what infrastructure is for. So we have to find ways of, difficult though it is, we have to find ways of producing this infrastructure.
Bom, eu vou, então, acho que o nosso presidente tá online, acho que não mais, né? O Carlos? Tá. Então, em nome aí, acho que, assim, não preciso nem enaltecer, né, a qualidade das palavras que foram tecidas aqui, desse encontro que já ficou histórico na nossa comissão. Uma felicidade enorme, né? Depois a gente pode, inclusive, fazer uma tradução para poder ficar ainda mais clara essas ideias, né? E obviamente, torná-las mais democráticas, mais inclusivas e mais abertas ainda, para que todos possam, de alguma forma, ter contato com elas. E eu queria agradecer muito a presença de todos, convidar todos, para quem quiser, pegar uma dedicatória, né? Vai ser um momento único de tentar fazer isso, né? Com Yescombe. Vocês que receberam o livro aqui, então fiquem à vontade, e depois tirarmos uma foto também, aproveitar esse momento e registrar essa historicidade desse encontro de hoje. Agradeço muito a participação de todos aqui, aqueles que estão nos ouvindo, né, virtualmente. Agradeço ao Renan e principalmente ao Yescombe, nosso NED, que veio aqui ao Brasil compartilhar os seus ensinamentos com todos nós. E a gente espera que cada vez mais com isso a gente possa refletir ideias virtuosas e que isso possa, de alguma forma, como ele bem disse, transformar a vida das pessoas. Muito obrigado. Obrigado mesmo.
Thank you.
Take a picture.
Okay. Yeah, I can do that.
Yeah, please.